Hello everyone, lecture 18 in a set of lectures entitled Thought as Word Dynamics, which is meant to be a philosophy for artificial intelligence in an approach to speech generation, an alternative to the top-down approaches that we find currently in generative large language models. When I developed it at the end of the 1980s, it was not conceived as being an alternative to these large language models for the very good reason that they did not exist at all. But it was meant to be an alternative to the current approaches there in the late 1980s, the current approaches to artificial intelligence. It all started in an article which was more or less commissioned from me on the theme, what artificial intelligence will owe to Sigmund Freud. Why? Because I was part of the committee of a magazine, a psychoanalytical magazine, French magazine, that was led at the time by Judith Miller, the daughter of Jacques Lacan, a quite famous psychoanalyst, and we were preparing a special issue on artificial intelligence. I was assigned the task to write that piece, although at the time I was essentially the anthropological columnist of the magazine. I went back to the whole idea, writing the current text, which I'm reading, Thought as Word Dynamics. I wrote that in the year 2000, being at that time in California. What we're starting today is the third part of the project, of my text, which has four parts, and the third part is about the dynamics of that network that I was conceiving at the time. My approach was connectionist, but it was not in a feed-forward type of approach to a neural network, an artificial neural network. What was at the core of my system was an artificial network, but of a very different nature than those which are used now in these feed-forward approaches of deep learning. It was an alternative type of approach with labels being attached to what can be represented. I mean, if we describe the model as being a connected, oriented graph with and weighted as long as edges are associated to particular weights, which is the way that actually artificial networks are being used. The difference is that there to any one of these edges is attached a label, and that the basic unit of the whole network is pair of words. And as I explained in the previous lectures, that notion I got from Aristotle in his book, which is part of the corpus called the Organon, the one called categories. And what he called categories is the association of word pairs with the underlying assumption of his that an isolated word has no meaning whatever, but that if you connect two words, then you have a unit can be regarded as being significant as far as meaning is concerned. The little chapter, short chapter that I'm going to comment today is called "The skeleton of each speech act is a path of finite length in the network." That particular network is the background for speech generation. How do you process, and I'll say a lot more about that later on, how do you process through that network when you produce a sentence? It's through gradient descent, and the gradient descent is defined by, is determined by emotional affect values, which are associated to these word pairs. A word in a word pair has no specific emotional value, but word pairs do have. So when I say apple and pear, apple has a specific emotional affect value, which is a weight attached to an edge in the network. And when I say apple and Eve, the same word apple has a different emotional value, a different affect value than when it's associated to pears. The apple connected to Eve has a different affect value that the apple associated with pears. I'll say a lot more about that. Acoustic imprints, which is words as we pronounce them, which are individual elements of the network, hold a static topological property emerging from their location within it. And how do you call that? That's what we call the meaning of the word. One particular instance of a word, because the apple connected to pears is not the exact same apple as the one attached to Eve. We can imagine the same type of object visually, but it's a total different affair when we have in a bowl in front of us an apple and a pear, and when we talk about an apple in connection with Eve. This meaning is nothing more than, in set theory terms, the union of all word pairs these words can be part of, with their immediate neighbors in the network. So when I say apple, without saying anything more, then I have to think of all the usages that apple has can have. This is a notion which was regarded as very new when Wittgenstein in the 1930s revived it. Actually, it is in Aristotle, and as we'll see, it's in other people too. But when Wittgenstein revived that idea that meaning is usage, it had been lost. People didn't look much at Aristotle's categories, and especially not linguists, which they should have. Our view hardly differs. My view, I mean, in that text, hardly differs on this subject from the one that was held by, and you will never guess by whom, by Niels Bohr, the physicist who played a leading role in the development of quantum mechanics. And as you probably know, the still most common interpretation of quantum mechanics is the one that Niels Bohr had introduced. But Niels Bohr was thinking about a lot of other things, and I was surprised when I developed that approach in the line of Aristotle back in 1987, 1988, to discover a few years later, although the book had been published in 1982, that in a book by Edward McKinnon called Scientific Explanation in Atomic Physics, published at the Chicago University Press in 1982, describing in detail what was Bohr's approach to atomic physics and the development of quantum mechanics, that he explained that that Bohr had a specific view about the way that words operate. And as you will see, Bohr was very prescient, because if you want to understand what happens really in large language models and in transformers, as being one of the major, the crucial part of the machinery, you will see that in the 1930s already. Niels Bohr, whose speciality was not at all to deal with linguistics, had in a couple of sentences had described what would explain what would happen later on as a mechanism within the large language models, and in particular what the transformer is actually achieving to do. Here I'm quoting from that book from McKinnon. I'm quoting first from the pages 354 to 355. Following Bohr, clarifying the meaning of a word involves showing how it relates to other words through logical structures somehow implicit in language. The word graph is not used, but I would say the concept is already there in underlying. Any attempt to consider a term in isolation from such logical structures as having a precise meaning is essentially misguided. The word is to be interpreted in the network and in terms of the connections of word pairs. In a particular context, an analysis of a term's meaning focuses on some aspects of the network of logical relations connecting this term to the body of language. So the idea which is central to Anella, the piece of software, of artificial intelligence software that I developed for British Telecom in the period between 1987 and 1990, what is there written in embryo in these short, brief reflections of Niels Bohr about language. It follows that the language we use to describe the world as experience is not susceptible to any sharp all-purposes distinctions between content and logical form. That appeared, I mean, this is transparently the case in the large language models, and when we realized very recently that just scaling up, making the model bigger, would make it possible that would appear within the quite spontaneously through self-organization, through an emergent process, that you would move from syntax to semantics without having to define, and that's how much, I mean, that's the extent to which things are opposed to the way that, for instance, Chomsky approached things. This all within the body, through scaling up, develops by self-organization. It follows that the language we use to describe the world as experience is not susceptible to any sharp, all-purposes distinction between content and logical form. Any form-content distinction is invariably context-dependent, and the larger the context, the more there'll be these emergent self-organization process. In an interview, Heisenberg, this is, I'm not quoting here from McKinnon, this is a comment. In an interview, Heisenberg reported the following, and this is again a quote from the book by McKinnon. Bohr said that when any word is produced, that word raises something into the light of consciousness, and at the same time it raises many other things which are only in the shaded light and are almost entirely covered. And all these things enter a consciousness at the same time. And what you hear there, that's the parallel reading that the transformer does within a generative model in a large language models. These parallel reading, this is exactly what's summoning as the meaning of a particular sentence all the words which are actually there, and awakening the brain, or in the case of Anella, the part of the network, which is actually the one activated for the production, the generation of a particular sentence. Individual path, and I'm not quoting McKinnon anymore, individual path, concatenation of word pairs on the network hold between inverted commas, logical propensities, a consequence of such elements being elicited along a path of interlocking pairs, one pair at a time. And as I mentioned in earlier of these, some earlier lectures in this series, a colleague of mine at part of the same Connex project was looking at my piece of software that I was developing actually on my own, and saying it needs a proper description, a proper name, and he had developed ANELA, associative network with emergent logical and learning abilities. I.e., what he saw there was that indeed, if you have a network of word pairs properly organized, meaning the way that we do when we acquire knowledge, then automatically, that's what Bohr is saying too, automatically logical will appear, in the same way as meaning will appear, what we call meaning, what we call logic, etc. And there's no need, again, to first develop syntactic rules and then epistemic rules for knowledge, and then logical rules. All that is already there in the topology of the network you have to constitute to represent the particular memory of an individual. Thus, a response in a stimulus-response perspective of speech performance might be surprisingly uncrude when envisaged as the pooling of a string of elements from the network which one language's lexicon constitutes. Saying something is producing a particular path in the lexicon of a language as it is properly organized. And as you know, in the large language models, it's been organized in terms of frequency, probability of appearing within a particular text, and then the approach I was developing in the late 80s in a psychoanalytical type of Freudian type of perspective. What was connecting these notions was the emotion. The things which are connected by the affect come together in our mind. Interestingly, using the probabilistic approach in terms of frequency and using the one from emotion leads to about the same type of output when you think about it. And in my book, Principe des systèmes intelligents, which I wrote and was published in 1989 as a kind of description of my project, I was saying something of the kind when I was saying that relevance, actually, when you look at a generation of sentences within a network of the type I was describing, that whether you look at it as a dynamics of affect or as a dynamics of relevance, produces the exactly same output. And if you then equate relevance with probability, frequency in actual speech generation, speech acts, you come up to about the same thing. So if you start from emotion, affect, leading to relevance, relevance to probability of occurrence, actually you have about the same thing. And this is an interesting equation because that tells a lot actually on who we are and how we function. What decides precisely of the path taken in any instance, and why the unfolding process ends when and where it does, making each uttered string of a finite length, are the affect values, the emotional values attached to the word pairs in the network. A good way to conclude because it summarizes, in fact, what I've been saying so far in these 18 lectures. Thank you so much for listening to me, and hopefully I'll see you next time when we'll be dealing with these issues once more. And as I said, this time talking about the dynamics of that network that I devoted some time to describe the topology of in the early lectures. Thank you so much.